Yes, so I would like to comment on an article I've recently published in English, Ukrainian, and Russian that has stirred some disagreement and debate. The Ukrainian title of it is "Як зробити Росію постімперською," or in English, on open democracy. The article was titled "Preparing for and Working Towards Democratic Russia," or also then simply the translation of the Ukrainian title, "How to Make Russia Post-Imperial." And the approach that I'm taking here is heavily related to the German experience after World War II. When Germany emerged as a defeated country from World War II, and although it had loaded upon itself an enormous amount of guilt and responsibility for human suffering in the first half of the 20th century, it was nevertheless integrated very quickly and very closely into Western structures during the 1950s. The European Steel and Coal Community, NATO, the European Economic Community, the European Atomic Community, the European Parliament. Into all of these organizations, the Federal Republic of Germany was included during the 1950s. And as a result of this and a whole number of other measures by the Western powers towards Germany, Germany has today become a full member of the Western Community of States, and even in certain regards a leading member or an exemplary, one could also say, a Western state. And that looks from the perspective today as something very natural and perhaps something that was bound to happen. But in the early 1950s, that was not the case. And if somebody had back then said that Germany would become an exemplary Western democracy, liberal democracy, many people would have regarded such a vision as overly optimistic and as inadequate, perhaps even. So this is one reference point, the post-war German history, and the other reference point is the immediate post-Soviet Russian history after the breakup of the Soviet Union, when arguably in the early 1990s there was a chance for the West to also integrate, somewhat following the German example, the young Russian Federation into the Western community of states. And some steps were taken in this direction, like the entry of Russia into the Council of Europe, the enlargement of the G7 to the G8, and a number of other smaller steps. But on the whole, what made the post-Cold War experience of the Western behavior towards the young Russian Federation different from the post-World War II Western behavior of the West towards post-fascist Germany was that there was no coherent plan, there was no project that the West was following towards early post-Soviet Russia, and that the behavior of the West towards early post-Soviet Russia was not adversarial, it was helpful, there were lots of projects, lots of initiatives, but there was no greater vision for post-Soviet Russia, and that was simply because the West was not prepared for such a development. The Western experts on the Soviet Union continued to analyze the Soviet Union and its defects and its problems until the very end of it, and there was no vision prepared by the Western expert community for a post-Soviet Russia that would be ready to westernize and to become a liberal democratic state. And for this reason, I think this historic chance was missed. I think there was such a historic chance. Some people would say there was never such a historic chance. Russia would have never become a saturated, liberal, democratic, post-imperial state. I think there was such a chance. There were tendencies in Russia that were conducive to an inclusion, like in the case of post-World War II Germany, into the Western community of states. But unfortunately, the West did not take the chance because, as I said, there was no coherent plan and larger vision for a post-Soviet Russia before the Soviet Union broke up. And what I'm proposing now in this article here is to completely switch the current discussion of Russia in the Western public and also in the Western experts community, and to try to think about a post-Putin Russia. What would happen once the Putin regime finally destroys itself, and to develop now already a vision for a post-Putinist Russia that would ensure a sustainable, democratic, non-imperialistic development of a post-Putinist Russia. Whether this moment will ever come, I don't know. This is certainly a speculation to a certain degree. But just for the case that there will be again a window of opportunity, as I think there was in the early 1990s, it would be good to have a plan for such a window of opportunity and not to let it go away again, as was the case in the early 1990s, I believe. And moreover, it would be, I think, beneficial to the political development of the current Russian state and Russian nation if the West would outline such a vision for Russian inclusion into a post-imperial Russia. And the idea here is basically to do something similar as was done with Germany in the post-war period, that to propose basically Russia a gradual way of entering Western organizations under the condition, of course, that Russia would decide to become a saturated nation state and to leave behind its imperial, neo-imperialistic ambitions that it is still exposing in its policies towards Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia especially right now, but also towards other countries. So what I want to say at the very beginning is that, of course, any inclusion of Russia into Western structures would have to be preceded by readiness and by a withdrawal of illegally stationed Russian troops outside the Russian Federation, namely in Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. So this is, I think, a precondition. And for that case then, and for the case of a democratic development inside Russia, the West should simply outline what could be in store for a Russia that wants to integrate with the West. And here I would say, and I would emphasize that what the West should propose for such a case would not only be a resumption of the course that the West had taken in the 1990s, a return of Russia into the G7, making it again the G8, a return to a close cooperation with NATO, a return to negotiations for membership of Russia in the OECD, which were interrupted in 2014 after the annexation of Crimea, but also to develop a larger plan for an integration of Russia into Western structures that would go beyond those attempts of the 1990s, and that would basically follow the example and the strategies that the West has developed for Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. And that basically the models that have now been developed, or the schemes that have now been developed for Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine would then function as models also for an integration of Russia into Western structures. And what I mean by that is, above all, the visa liberalization action plan that has been applied, for instance, to Ukraine by the European Union and has led to a visa-free regime for Ukrainians in the Schengen zone. The association agreements that the European Union has signed with Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova, and this is perhaps the most contentious point, a membership action plan for Russia that would include Russia eventually into the North Atlantic Alliance, into NATO. And the idea behind all that is that such a vision for a future Russia would basically provide the Russian people with an alternative path of development that would be very different from the current course that Putin has chosen, and that would basically propose to the Russians a far-reaching inclusion of Russia into the major Western structures, including at the end perhaps even a full membership in NATO. I think a full membership in the European Union would be much more complicated because the European Union is a more complicated organization. But the association agreements that have been already signed today with Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia could be templates also for a relationship with Russia, because these association agreements imply a very far-reaching integration, in fact, already of Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova into the economic and legal space of the European Union, and that would be then also could be a model for relations with Russia. All of that, I think, will only be possible after Putin, and it will also be only possible if there is indeed a post-Putinist Russia, if there is not a restoration of some sort of Putinism without Putin, after Putin leaves the stage. At some point, for simply biological reasons, he will have to leave the stage. Perhaps he will have to leave the stage already for political reasons before. When exactly that will happen and how exactly that will happen, I don't know, and I think nobody knows. But it will happen at some point, and if then Russia will actually choose to search for other developmental paths, the European Union and NATO and the entire West should come with an offer, and I've shortly outlined here the offer that should be provided to Russia. I think a post-Putinist Russia is possible, not so much because I see a large democratic movement in Russia or a strong intellectual undercurrent that would sort of ensure that, but because the current socio-economic system that is still in place in Russia is unsustainable. And my hope is here not so much that somebody like Alexei Navalny will become then a new and strong force in Russian politics, which he may become at some point, but I think what would have to happen before that is that the Putin system will self-destruct from inside and by itself. And I think that will eventually happen because, as I mentioned, the current socioeconomic order that Russia has is unsustainable. It still functions, but basically Russia is a kleptocracy, a petrostate, has a rentier system where the people in power, they extracting a rent from the economy of the Russian Federation, and this is not a sustainable order. This is only sustainable if the price of oil shoots up again. Then indeed Russia could exist in its current state for a longer period of time. But I think if one assumes that this will not happen, that the oil price will not go over $100 per barrel again as it used to be, then I think the system is in trouble and it will become less and less efficient over the years. What will also happen is that the international weight of Russia will sink, at least in relative terms, over the next years, maybe even in absolute terms. The other countries, the other competitors of Russia will be rising, whereas Russia will be either stagnating or falling in its international weight. And for these reasons, I think there will be, maybe even before actually the system starts to self-destruct itself, there will be a tendency in Russia, an increasing tendency to discuss where Russia is going. And that, I think, will then lead to thinking about alternatives. And if then this discussion starts about alternatives, I think the West should come with a comprehensive vision of what such an alternative could be. And at the end of the day, I think this Russia's westernization, Russia's inclusion into Western structures and close association with the European Union and perhaps even entry into NATO is the only, as I see it, long-term geopolitical and geoeconomic option that Russia has. I don't see any other options. Russia is by itself too weak to become a self-sustaining pole in the international order, and it has no other potential friends on the international sphere. The current partnership with China is a sort of axis of convenience, as it has been called. I don't think there is a sustainable alliance here in store between Russia and China. China will simply not need Russia for achieving its goals and achieving its geopolitical standing. Russia is too weak to become a self-sustaining pole itself. I think also that the Eurasian Economic Union is under question, whether it will function properly, whether it will exist for a long period of time. And therefore, I think sooner or later there will be a domestic Russian discussion about what to do actually with the Russian state in the future and how to make it sustainable, how to create an order that will promise a certain future. And that is, I think, only something that will be in close association with the European Union and in an alliance with the entire West. And that is something, of course, that is certainly not now the mainstream opinion in Russia. It's also something I think that many in the West would regard as a rather bold speculation, or perhaps even as irresponsible fantasy. But I think it would be useful to develop such a vision and to also publicize such a vision, to give those people who still exist in Russia, who have pro-Western and European Russia in mind, an instrument in their hand with which they can argue in the public sphere, and to provide such a vision also for pragmatic reasons in order to strengthen those forces inside Russia that are non-imperialistic, that are pro-democratic, that are pro-Western. And I think these forces will in the next years gradually strengthen, and they will get more and more prominence simply because there are no other, I think, long-term options for Russia. So this is basically my proposal, and I think it would be also eventually to the benefit of such countries as Ukraine, because all of this, as I mentioned at the beginning, implies that Russia would basically declare itself both officially and also unofficially a saturated nation state that is fine within the current officially recognized borders of the Russian Federation, and that would not send any troops or mercenaries or Cossacks or adventurers across the Russian border to other countries where these people are not welcome, and this would then also resolve the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. But again, a precondition for all of that would be, of course, that there would have to come first a destruction of the current Putin system, a discussion about the future of Russia inside the Russian elite and the Russian population, and then the West could come with a bargain which would say that if Russia becomes non-imperialistic, if Russia becomes truly democratic, then the West has the following offers to make, and the West is ready to go very far in its future cooperation with Russia. That would then, of course, also include such countries as Georgia and Moldova and Ukraine, because they have their own integration paths with the West that would then sort of coincide with the future or precede a future Russian integration with the West.